In the remote villages of 17th century Spain, life was governed by two powerful forces, faith and fear. It was a world of harsh landscapes and profound religious belief, where the line between a miracle and a curse was dangerously thin. The birth of a child was a blessing. The birth of a healthy, robust child, a sign of God's favor. But what happens when that blessing grows too large? When the miracle becomes monstrous in the eyes of those who once celebrated it? This is the story of a little girl whose life began as a village marvel, but whose body would become her prison, a spectacle for the cruel amusement of a royal court. Her name was Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, but history would remember her by a different, more terrible name, a name given to her by a king. Our story begins on a Sunday morning in 1674, in the small village of Miranda de Montilla, inside the ancient stone church. As the priest was celebrating Mass, a woman named Antonia de la Bodega suddenly went into labor. There was no time to find a midwife, no time to return home. Surrounded by stunned parishioners, she gave birth to her daughter right there, on the cold church floor. To the deeply superstitious villagers, this was no ordinary birth. It was a sign. A child brought into the world in such a sacred place was surely destined for an extraordinary life. They named her Eugenia, meaning well-born or noble, a hopeful prophecy for the little girl who had made such a dramatic entrance. In her first few months, Eugenia seemed to fulfill that prophecy. She was a healthy baby with a strong appetite. In an age when infant mortality was tragically common, her rapid growth was seen as a mark of divine protection. A plump child was a healthy child, a promise of vitality and good fortune. Her parents, Jose and Antonia, were simple peasants, proud of their seemingly blessed daughter. They watched her grow with joy, attributing her remarkable size to God's abundance. But as the months turned into a year, their joy began to curdle into a quiet, gnawing worrying. By her first birthday, Eugenia weighed an astonishing 55 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of a typical 1-year-old. Her growth was relentless, her hunger insatiable. The villagers who had once celebrated her miraculous birth now began to whisper. The family's pride slowly transformed into shame. They sought answers from local physicians and healers, but 17th century medicine had no explanation for Eugenia's condition. Prayers were offered, potions were administered. Nothing worked. As Eugenia grew, so did her isolation. The child who was once a miracle was now becoming an outcast. By the time she was 6 years old, Eugenia weighed 155 pounds, the size of a fully grown woman. Her body, once a symbol of health, was now seen as grotesque. The blessed child had become, in the eyes of her community, a living curse. Her parents, overwhelmed by shame and fear, began to hide her away, confining her to their small, humble home. But you cannot hide a story like this forever. Tales of the giant child of Montilla began to spread, carried by traveling merchants and pilgrims. These whispers traveled across the rugged landscape of Spain, over 200 miles, until they finally reached the one place where such a story would be met not with fear, but with intrigued delight: the royal court in Madrid. The rumors had reached the ears of those who collected such wonders, and for Eugenia, the world was about to change forever. The summons arrived like a decree from another world, a royal command, delivered to a humble peasant family, that could not be refused. The king, Charles II, had heard the tales of the giant child from the north, and he was intrigued. For Eugenia's parents, this was both a terrifying and a hopeful moment. It meant surrendering their daughter to a world of unimaginable power and splendor, a world they could never hope to understand. But it also offered an escape from the cruelty of their village, and perhaps the promise of a better life, even better care, for their daughter. The long journey to Madrid was an ordeal. Traveling in a specially reinforced cart, Eugenia was no longer just a village outcast. She was a public spectacle. At every town and village along the way, crowds gathered to stare at the monster child. Her arrival at the Royal Alcazar in Madrid marked the final, irrevocable end of her childhood. She stepped from a world of stone, and dirt into a universe of gold and silk. To a 6-year-old girl who had known only a small village, the palace must have seemed like a bewildering dream of endless corridors, towering tapestries, and glittering chandeliers. But this gilded cage would soon prove to be more prison than palace. She was immediately presented to the king. Charles II, a man plagued by his own physical and mental afflictions from generations of royal inbreeding, was reportedly delighted. He saw in Eugenia not a suffering child, but a fascinating new acquisition for his collection. It was the king himself who bestowed upon her the nickname that would eclipse her real name for centuries, La Monstrua, the monster. It was said not with intentional cruelty, but with the casual dehumanization of a man who saw people with differences as objects of entertainment. This was the dark tradition of the Spanish Habsburg court. For centuries, they had deliberately collected individuals with physical and mental disabilities, known euphemistically as gente de placer, people of pleasure. More cruelly, they were sometimes called sabandillas del palacio, vermin of the palace. These people, dwarfs, giants, jesters, and others with unusual conditions, lived in a strange limbo. They were not servants, but they were not guests. They were fed and clothed in finery, but they were never paid, never respected, and never truly seen as human. They existed for a single purpose: to amuse the nobility and to reinforce a twisted principle of beauty. By surrounding themselves with those they deemed ugly or grotesque, the aristocrats believed their own refinement would shine more brightly. It was a calculated system of exploitation, and Eugenia was now its newest, most prized exhibit. The royal tailors were immediately commissioned to create magnificent gowns for her, transforming the peasant child into a courtly spectacle. She was dressed in sumptuous red and white brocade, adorned with silver buttons and lace that would have cost more than her family's entire yearly income. But these beautiful clothes were a costume, designed to make her appearance even more striking, to mark her as the property of the crown. Her insatiable hunger, the symptom of a disease no one could comprehend, was now indulged. The royal kitchens provided her with an endless supply of breads, meats, and sweets, a generosity that only worsened her condition, while ensuring she remained docile and dependent. Her daily life became a rigid routine of performance. She was brought out for court gatherings, displayed at diplomatic receptions, and used as a living prop. Noble ladies delighted in being seen next to her, the stark contrast in size emphasizing their own slender figures. What no one in that glittering, cruel world could know was the truth of her condition. Eugenia was suffering from what we now call Prader-Willi Syndrome, a rare genetic disorder affecting the part of the brain that controls hunger. She was trapped in a body that was perpetually starving. Her brain never received the signal that she was full. Her constant eating was not a sign of gluttony, but a biological prison from which there was no escape. She was a sick child, in desperate need of medical care and compassion. Instead, she was treated as a miracle of nature, a prodigy sent by God for the amazement and delight of the court, as one royal physician wrote in a pamphlet published about her. And then, King Charles, so fascinated by his living treasure, decided to immortalize her. He summoned his court painter, the celebrated artist Juan Carreño de Miranda, and gave him an unprecedented commission. He was to paint a portrait of La Monstrua, one in all her costumed glory, the other completely nude. The commission given to Juan Carreño de Miranda was perhaps one of the most unusual and morally complex in the history of Spanish art. Carreño was the principal court painter, a man of immense skill and reputation. The successor to the legendary Velázquez, he had spent his life capturing the austere dignity of kings, queens, and nobles, immortalizing their power in oil and canvas. Now, he was being asked to paint a monster, but the monster was a 6-year-old child. What must have gone through his mind as he prepared his studio, as he mixed his colors and stretched his canvases? He was a servant of the crown, and the royal command was not a request. But he was also an artist, and the highest calling of an artist is to capture truth. The king wanted a spectacle, but what truth would Carreño choose to paint? The sittings themselves must have been a strange, quiet ordeal. Imagine little Eugenia, taken from the noisy, chaotic world of the court and placed in the solemn silence of the painter's studio. The room would have been filled with the scent of linseed oil and turpentine. She would have been forced to stand still 4 hours, a difficult task for any child, let alone one whose body was already a source of discomfort. She would have been dressed in the magnificent red and white gown, its heavy brocade weighing on her small frame, a constant, itchy reminder that she was a prop, a thing to be looked at, and all the while, she would have been under the intense, analytical gaze of the artist, a gaze that was not like the curious, mocking stares of the courtiers. This was a different kind of observation, a deeper kind, a gaze that sought to understand the very architecture of her face, the texture of her skin, the light in her eyes. The first portrait, the one that would become known as La Monstrua vestida, the clothed monster, is a masterpiece of contradiction. At first glance, it is a formal court portrait like any other. Eugenia stands in her opulent gown, her small hands positioned delicately, one holding an apple, a conventional pose for a noble child. The fabric is rendered with breathtaking skill. Almost feel the texture of the silk. See the gleam of the silver thread. She is presented with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a member of the royal household. She is, in every technical sense, an object of value. But then, you look at her face, and the entire artifice collapses. Carreño has painted her with a brutal, almost unbearable honesty. Her face is round and puffy, her features flattened by her condition. But it is her eyes that stop you. They are not the eyes of a monster. They are not vacant, or simple, or happy. They are the eyes of a profoundly sad and weary old soul trapped in the body of a child. There is a deep, knowing melancholy in her gaze, a quiet resignation. She looks directly at us, the viewers, and her expression seems to ask a silent question across the centuries. It is a look that seems to understand, on some fundamental level, that she is being displayed, not honored, used, not celebrated. Art historians have debated this portrait for generations. Was Carreño simply a master realist, painting exactly what he saw? Or was this a deliberate act of subversion? Was he using his incredible skill to fulfill the king's commission on the surface, while embedding a secret, compassionate critique within the painting itself? Was he telling us, you see the fine dress, the royal setting. Now look closer. Look at her eyes. This is not a monster. This is a prisoner. If the clothed portrait was a subtle subversion, the second portrait, La Monstrua desnuda, the nude monster, is a direct confrontation with the cruelty of the commission. The very act of painting a nude portrait of a child, particularly one with a physical disability, is shocking even to modern sensibilities. In the 17th century, it was an act of profound objectification. It strips away not only her clothing, but any pretense of dignity afforded by her courtly role. Here, she's posed like a figure from classical mythology. She holds a bunch of grapes in one hand, a clear and deliberate reference to Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, revelry, and excess. This artistic choice is a devastating one. It takes her medical condition, the insatiable hunger she cannot control, and recasts it as a moral failing. She is no longer a sick child. She is a mythological symbol of gluttony. Her body is not the result of a genetic disorder, but of indulgence. It is a cruel, intellectual game played at her expense, designed to delight a court that valued clever illusions over human compassion. Yet again, Carreño's honesty creates a deeply unsettling effect. He does not idealize her form. He paints the rolls of flesh, the strained skin, the disproportioned limbs with an unflinching, clinical precision. The result is a portrait that is incredibly difficult to look at. It is both a work of art and a document of exploitation, and it forces us to ask an even more difficult question about the artist. Was he a willing participant in this humiliation? Or is this portrait an even more radical act of protest? By stripping away the beautiful gown, is he forcing the viewer to confront the raw, unvarnished reality of her suffering? Is he saying, you want to see the monster? Here she is, not a creature of myth, but a real, vulnerable, suffering child. Look at her, truly look at her. without the distraction of silks and jewels, and see what you have created. Perhaps Carreño, trapped in his role as the king's painter, used his art as the only form of dissent available to him. He could not refuse the commission, but he could ensure that the portraits told a deeper, more truthful story than the king ever intended. He painted a spectacle, but he imbued it with a soul. The two paintings were completed around 1680. They were an immediate sensation. The court was enthralled. Here was their prize, their human curiosity, immortalized forever by the greatest painter in the land. Copies were made. The images were discussed and analyzed in letters that traveled across Europe. Eugenia's fame or infamy was sealed. But in this process, something was irrevocably lost. The real girl, Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, began to disappear, replaced by the powerful image of La Monstrua. Her identity was no longer her own. It was defined by the brushstrokes of a master, by the cruel nickname of a king, by the gaze of 1,000 strangers. Her painted self began a long journey through history. But what of the real girl? What was her life like, day after day, inside that golden cage, once the artist's gaze had finally turned away? With the portraits completed, Eugenia's role as a court fixture was solidified. Her image, now famous, preceded her. She was no longer just a curiosity, she was a work of art, a living painting. Her daily life at the court of Charles II was a meticulously choreographed performance, designed entirely for the pleasure of others. Each morning, servants would dress her in her elaborate gowns. Her routine was not that of a child, but of a prized object being prepared for display. The palace courtiers, particularly the noble ladies, developed a cruel habit of using her as a human measuring stick. They would pose for portraits standing next to Eugenia, the stark contrast in their figures, serving to accentuate their own fashionable slenderness and conventional beauty. These were not private moments, but public spectacles, with nobles gathering to comment on Eugenia's size, as if discussing a piece of sculpture. Diplomatic visits were perhaps the most humiliating rituals. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries were invariably treated to a viewing of the court's collection of human curiosities, and Eugenia was always the main attraction. She would be positioned in a grand reception hall, expected to remain silent and still as strangers stared, pointed, and discussed her condition in hushed tones. She was reduced to the status of a museum exhibit, a living symbol of the Spanish crown's power to possess even the most unusual of nature's creations. The psychological weight of this existence is almost impossible to fathom. Though she was surrounded by people, she was profoundly alone. She received no formal education. She was given no opportunity to form genuine friendships with other children. Her world was a gilded prison of observation and objectification. Contemporary accounts, written by the very people who exploited her, offer fleeting and unreliable glimpses into her inner life. They describe her as having a pleasant personality, and some noted that she seemed to enjoy the endless supply of fine food and the attention. But can we trust these observations? They come from a perspective that never once considered her a fully realized human being. To them, her contentment was simply a sign that their prize was well kept. Like a prized horse in a royal stable, the only unfiltered window we have into her soul remains Carreño's portraits, particularly the profound, sorrowful wisdom in her eyes. Modern psychological analysis of these paintings suggests a child who was acutely aware of her circumstances. The sadness in her gaze is not vacant, it is intelligent. It is the look of someone who understands she is a captive, a performer in a play she did not choose. This systemic cruelty was compounded by complete medical ignorance. The concept of Prader-Willi Syndrome would not be identified by science for another 275 years. In the 17th century, her condition was interpreted through the lens of superstition. It was a divine punishment, a demonic influence, or simply an inexplicable, and therefore amusing, freak of nature. This lack of understanding meant that her treatment was not only neglectful, but actively harmful. Instead of receiving care to manage her condition, she was indulged in ways that accelerated her physical decline. The royal kitchens, in an act of what seemed like generosity, gave her unlimited access to the rich foods her body could not process. This only worsened her health, a slow, inadvertent form of poisoning by kindness. The court physicians who examined her were more interested in documenting her as a marvel than in treating her as a patient. Their pamphlets described her measurements with clinical detachment, but showed no curiosity about the underlying cause of her suffering or any desire to alleviate it. As Eugenia grew from a child into a teenager, new challenges emerged. The constant strain on her body began to take its toll. Her mobility, already limited, became increasingly difficult. The amusing giant child was becoming a sick young woman, a medical tragedy that the court was utterly unprepared and unwilling to confront. And as her health deteriorated, so did her value as entertainment. By the 1690s, as Eugenia entered her 20s, the novelty of her presence had faded. The court had moved on to new spectacles, new amusements. The woman who had once been the center of attention found herself increasingly ignored, relegated to the margins of palace life. The same condition that had made her a celebrity made her a burden. And for the last years of her life, the girl who had lived under a constant, suffocating spotlight was plunged into a new kind of darkness, the darkness of being forgotten. The final years of Eugenia's life are a testament to the fleeting nature of courtly favor and the brutal indifference of power. The silence in the historical record speaks volumes. Where once every detail of her arrival and appearance was documented in pamphlets and letters, the last decade of her life passed largely unnoticed. She continued to live within the palace walls, a ghost in the gilded machine that had once paraded her as its star attraction. She still received food and basic care, but the fascination that had defined her existence had evaporated. This neglect was perhaps the cruelest turn of all. As a young woman in her 20s, Eugenia would have been facing the most severe health complications of Prader-Willi Syndrome, the unrelenting strain on her heart and joints, the high risk of diabetes and respiratory failure. These were the invisible realities of her condition, and she faced them essentially alone. Her suffering was no longer entertaining, so it became invisible. The few accounts that survive from this period are brief and dismissive, noting her continued presence at religious services, as if her piety was the only interesting characteristic she had left. But what of her inner world? Was she lonely? Was she in pain? Did she miss the attention? Or was the quiet a welcome relief? We will never know, because no one thought to ask. No one at court ever seemed to consider what Eugenia might want for her own life. She had spent nearly 2 decades as a royal possession, and as her entertainment value expired, so did any interest in her future. The end came around the year 1699. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo passed away at approximately 25 years of age. The specific cause was not recorded, or if it was, the document has been lost to time. This lack of information is the final, damning proof of the court's indifference. The woman whose arrival had been heralded as a prodigy of nature departed the world in silence. The only official record of her passing, found in palace inventory logs, which coldly note the return of her gowns, jewelry, and other personal effects to royal storage. In death, as in life, she was reduced to a list of objects, her humanity erased by the neat script of a palace bureaucrat. For centuries, that was where her story ended. She was forgotten, a footnote in the long history of the Spanish Empire. Her only legacy was Carreño's powerful, disturbing portraits. They continued to hang in royal collections, viewed by generations of people who saw them as masterpieces of Baroque art, but who knew nothing of the sad little girl who had been forced to pose for them. The paintings that had immortalized her suffering also sealed her fate as an eternal object, forever la Monstrua, the monster on the wall. It wasn't until the late 20th century, nearly 300 years after her passing, that scholars began to look again, with the tools of modern medicine and a new sensitivity to social history. They began to piece together the truth. Medical historians, examining the contemporary descriptions of her symptoms, recognized the clear signs of Prader-Willi syndrome. This posthumous diagnosis was a revolutionary act. It transformed her story from a tale of a gluttonous monster into the tragedy of a sick child suffering from a complex genetic disorder. It replaced moral judgment with medical understanding. Social historians, meanwhile, placed her experience within the broader, brutal context of how European courts systematically exploited people with disabilities. They gave a name to the system that consumed her, exposing the cruelty behind the people of pleasure. Eugenia's story was being reclaimed. This slow rehabilitation of her memory reached for a powerful, tangible climax in 1997. The city of Arvils, the birthplace of the painter Juan Carreño de Miranda, decided to erect a monument, but the statue was not of the famous artist. It was a life-sized bronze sculpture of Eugenia, based on her clothed portrait. After 3 centuries of being remembered as a monster, she was finally being honored as a person. The statue stands in a public square, a permanent and poignant tribute. It shows her as she was, a child, dressed in a magnificent gown, her expression full of that same profound, heartbreaking sadness that Carreño captured so long ago. The statue forces all who see it to confront the story of the girl behind the painting, to acknowledge her dignity centuries after it was denied to her. Her story, once buried in archives and art galleries, was finally being told, not as a tale of a courtly curiosity, but as a story of human resilience and systemic cruelty. The girl who had been silenced for so long was finally being heard, and her voice, speaking to us from across the centuries, raises questions that are as urgent today as they were in the 17th century. It challenges us to look at our own world, at the way we treat those who are different, and to ask ourselves a difficult question: have we really changed that much at all? The story of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo resonates so powerfully today because it is not, in the end, a relic of a barbaric past. It is a mirror. The specific cruelties of the 17th century Spanish courts may be gone, but the underlying attitudes that enabled her exploitation persist in more subtle, insidious forms throughout our own modern world. The tendency to view people with disabilities as sources of inspiration, objects of pity, or curiosities for entertainment, rather than as full human beings with their own agency, echoes the court's treatment of Eugenia. What is the modern phenomenon of inspiration porn? Viral videos of disabled people performing everyday tasks, framed to make able-bodied viewers feel better about their own lives, if not a digital version of the principle of contrast that reigned at Versailles and the Alcazar. Eugenia's life also serves as a timeless indictment of medical ignorance. The centuries that passed between her suffering and the scientific identification of Prader-Willi Syndrome are a stark reminder that a lack of knowledge is not an excuse for a lack of compassion. Her story challenges us to support and advocate for those with rare diseases and complex conditions, to ensure that no one's suffering is dismissed simply because it is not yet understood. The portraits themselves, still hanging in the Prado Museum in Madrid, continue to raise complex ethical questions. Is their display an ongoing act of exploitation, or is it a vital tool for education? They force us to confront our own role as viewers, to question the way we consume images of vulnerable people, and to think critically about the line between art and objectification. Perhaps most importantly, Eugenia's story forces us to look inward. The courtiers who called her La Monstrua were not uniquely evil, they were ordinary people, products of a system that taught them to value conformity and to see difference as a flaw to be either pitied or mocked. We must ask ourselves, what systems of thinking exist in our own time that teach us similar lessons? How do our media, our social structures, and our beauty standards create modern-day monsters out of those who do not fit a narrow, arbitrary definition of normal? In the end, the girl who was called a monster reveals the true monstrosity to be a society that strips people of their dignity for its own amusement. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo deserved to be remembered not as a curiosity, not as a victim, and not as a portrait, but as a person whose life, however constrained and exploited, possessed the same inherent worth as any other. Her legacy challenges us to build a world where no child's difference becomes their prison, and where every person's humanity is recognized as sacred. The bronze statue in her veils will wither and age, but the questions Eugenia's life asks of us about dignity, about compassion, and about the responsibilities of power will endure as long as we continue to struggle with the challenge of seeing the person, not the difference.